Well, it really wasn't a big surprise that Shogun became a miniseries. The book was published in 1975, the James Clavell book. And he had written two other novels before that, Taipan and King Rat, which were big sellers. But Shogun sold millions of copies. And then I heard that NBC, with Paramount, was going to make Shogun. Sure enough, they were doing it, a 12-hour miniseries. And the head of television at Paramount at that time was Gary Nardino. And he hired Eric Bercovici to write the screenplay.
I got the call from Gary Nardino, and I know the date. It was February 9th, 1979, asking me to go see James Clavell at Paramount in his office. And I told James Clavell my idea, which was to take his story, turn it inside out, and tell the whole tale of Shogun from Blackthorne's point of view, where we understand what he understands, where we see what he sees, and whenever he is confused, we are equally confused. And the next morning, he handed me this paperback of Shogun, which he had torn pages out of and X'd, crossed things out, and made a bunch of marks in, and he said, "Here, it works."
I think it was very important that Eric Bercovici kept the truth of the novel into the screenplay, because so many people had read the book that if we changed it or improvised it or took a dramatic license, we would have been really unfair to the great material.
So the first thing I did was I read the book from beginning to end 4 times. I spent, I think, 7 or 8 days doing that before I did anything else. Because the story was so complex, what I tried to do is memorize it.
His adaptation of the novel was really true to the novel, and he also had a responsibility to James Clavell, which he took very seriously.
And then James and I began looking for a director. And we watched a couple of miniseries that Jerry had directed and decided, well, let's meet him.
And the first thing he said when I met him, he says, "Are you crazy?" Because I said, "Why?" He says, "You got to be mad to tackle a project this big, and it's impossible. I said, "I'm writing it, but I don't know if we'll ever be able to make this thing."
I said, it's going to ruin your marriage, it's going to ruin your life, everything I could imagine to shake him up. And he didn't shake. And at that point on, we became bound at the hip. Because if we hadn't been, the whole thing would have fallen apart.
They sent me to Japan to do some location scouting. And that whole idea of how to work with these people, Clavell he knew it upside down and backwards. So he was a big step into breaking us into that culture. And then when I came back, I started reading the scripts, which were quite wonderful. And I said, "You know, Eric, you're going to be there." He says, "No, I'm not going to be there." I said, "You got to be, because, well, you know, we're going to do rewrites and so forth as we go. We can't do it production-wise exactly."
I went to Japan as the writer. And while I was there, Paramount asked me if I would produce it. And I said, absolutely, I would be delighted to produce it. And then Paramount realized they were putting me in charge of a lot of money, and they didn't entirely trust me with a lot of money, because I was more concerned with the product than the budget. And happily, this is another instance of the gods smiling on the project. The person that Paramount chose to bring over as a production executive was Frank Cardia.
Eric went over to do the production rewrite and begin the prep, and that's when he called me, like 24 hours after he got there, and said, "It's spiraling out of control. Can you get involved? And I'm going to recommend to Paramount that you get involved." And so I really got to Japan about 6 months before the actual start of production, and some of the picture had been prepped at that point.
So we were basically a bunch of pals making this movie. To go into a project like this, literally into an unknown world. None of us had ever been to Japan in the 1600s before. It required a certain group of people with a certain attitude to make it work.
Turn, you whore from hell! Turn, damn you! Turn!
I was doing, I think, Cyrano de Bergerac at the Amundsen Theater, or maybe it was Night of the Iguana, I can't remember which. But somebody came backstage. There were a bunch of people backstage one night after the show and in my dressing room, and somebody I'd never seen before said, "Have you read Shogun?" And I said, "Hmm? Have you read Shogun?" It was a hugely popular novel. I just didn't happen to know about it. And I said, "No." And he said, "Read it. Make a great miniseries."
From what I heard, that they went to Sean Connery, and he liked the material, but of course he had never done television, so he didn't want to do it. And then they went to Roger Moore, and for some reason, whether he was not available or didn't want to do it, I never heard. And then the whole list came out, Albert Finney and so forth, and I think that NBC said, look, we want a recognizable name. Get me one big recognizable name, and of course Richard was.
I knew I had to play Blackthorn. I had to play Blackthorn. And so I started to chase it down.
He came in and he met us at Paramount, and he looked great. He looked a beard, and he looked like a pirate.
I was all dolled up with a beard and everything, trying to be as Blackthorn as possible, you know. And he bought the act and was very instrumental in getting me the part, because James Clavell really did want Sean Connery, and then he really did want a British actor to play the part. But largely because of Eric, I got the part.
The amount of work that he had to do, physically, forget the words, the amount of physical work that he had to do, Richard had to have been exhausted every single night, because he carried the whole production. It was all on his back.
Well, I read everything I could find historically about this character and about the time. I'm never sure if that does any good. I'm never sure whether that kind of research helps, because most of what you need is right there on the page.
Working with Richard Chamberlain was wonderful. He was a warm-hearted person and looking after me all the time. And yes, I had known him from Dr. Kildare.
He worked under extremely difficult conditions. He worked with a leading lady who didn't speak a word of English, as talented and wonderful as she was. We worked in the heat of summer, the cold of winter, very primitive stages and conditions. We worked 18-hour days, and the man never stopped smiling. He never once complained. Had there been any other actor, I think 20 years later, we'd still be there shooting.
With Lord Toranaga's permission, and with my ship and with a little help, we can split the cargo, all silks and bullion.
All the Japanese actors were day players. We could not afford to hire them for the whole film the way we hired Richard and the English actors. And so the whole schedule depended on their availability, and that included Mifune. We did not have Mifune under contract for the whole film. So there was a constant negotiation going on as to his availability, what days he could work for us and what days he could work for the other projects that he was doing at the same time. It got very tight on a few occasions.
The first time I met him, I was up in the office, up in the studio, and some guy walks in, and I look at him and say, looks familiar, but I didn't recognize him, because in civilian clothes, he just doesn't have that majestic grandeur that Toshiro has. But as soon as he put on that costume, he became not only Toranaga, he becomes a king. The guy is magic.
Well, after seeing all those Kurosawa films in which he was just unbelievable. And then on set the first time, when in his samurai gear, he was unapproachably animal. He'd sometimes sit on a little stool facing a wall and kind of just growl like some kind of caged beast. Nobody would go up to him. Nobody would approach him in his samurai garb, except on official business. Nobody would go near him, as far as I know.
He was completely in character. You know, whenever he came on, in fact, the only time I ever saw Richard even slightly nonplussed, he came up to me one day. He said, you know, if Mifune doesn't say, "Good morning, Richard," to me one of these days after I've said, "Good morning, Mr. Mifune," to him, I think I'll hit him. He didn't mean it. Mifune was just matchless.
Toshiro was the consummate, professional and brilliant actor. He had more stage presence than anyone I've ever worked with. I mean, if you had your back to the stage door when he walked in, you felt him coming in. He was just incredible. And he's a god. He was a god there. It was like working with the John Wayne of Japan.
He was so into the role when he was on the set, but sometimes he showed charming side of him.
Personally, so sweet sometimes, and surprisingly so. I remember once he was in his samurai gear, and I was like that. But there was a lunch break, and I had something valuable that I wanted to hide and didn't want to just leave on the set, so I stuck it up in the rafters of this set. And Mifune-san was around, and he started to laugh, and he laughed and laughed and laughed and said, "You're so Japanese." He said, "That's what the Japanese do. They hide their money in rafters. They don't take it to the bank. They don't trust the bank. They hide it in the rafters, or they put it under the mattress, or they bury it in the ground."
He was splendid, Toshiro. He was always there, willing to do everything. And when there was some kind of confusion about what the Japanese actors would do, he would step right in. Mifune would step right in and says, "No, no, no," and he would tell them what to do.
See the pilot? The engine car? You're the pilot of the Dutchman?
I am the pilot. Who are you?
Good, good. I'm Vasco Rodriguez, pilot of this galley, at least on this miserable trip.
I was still writing the script, and Jerry and James went off to London to cast all of the English parts. The Dutch sailors were all cast in England, which is rather interesting. They were off casting, and I was still writing, so that gave us a good idea if the project was going to go ahead. And Jerry and James found John Rhys Davies in London, who played Rodriguez, who was an absolute gift to the whole project.
There are parts, and there are actor-proof parts. We dream about actor-proof parts. Actor-proof parts are parts that even you can't screw up. Even I can't screw up.
I feel I discovered John Rhys Davies because he hadn't really done anything before then. I mean, he was magic. He was magic for the show. And of course, he went on to do all of Spielberg's pictures and everything else.
I owe Maud whatever career that I've had. I owe Jerry my career.
John Rhys Davies was extravagant and big, very savvy, very clever, and very good at stealing scenes. So you've got to be very careful with him.
As I studied the script and studied the part and wondered how I would play the thing, I realized that my function had to be the powerhouse, the engine in this piece. I had to come in with twice as much energy as I should have done, say the words twice as fast as I should have done, and use that energy to drive the scene forward. That would then give Richard time to underplay for a change, take his time, and that energy would then transfer itself into the next few scenes.
I'll blow your head off, Ingles, if you got some damn trick up your sleeve.
I give you my word. Pilot the pilot. And I'll swear on your mother's virtue.
I'm beginning to like you, Ingles. Hey! Torasama! Ikimashoka! Oi!
I certainly knew that I was onto a good thing because the very first time I met Berkovici, this then fearsome-looking, bearded, piratical fellow, came bouncing up to me and, he said, "Now listen, you son of a bitch, you're playing my part, so get it right." When you're actually playing the writer's favorite part, you're on a pretty safe wicket.
Lord Toranaga is very wise. His karma is great.
Thy beauty is greater.
And thy patience is small.
The most dramatic casting I got involved in was the leading lady. One of our many production problems was about a week before the start of production. Another woman had been cast as Mariko. And subsequent between her being cast and the start of production, she was also a singer.
And so we never even worried about that part because we knew we had her. Until the schedule went out and her manager said, "Oh, well, we can't work this day. We can't work this day. We can't." I said, "Why?" I said, "Well, she's on tour. She's singing." I said, "No, you don't understand. We want this girl for 6 months. It's the biggest part in the picture next to Blackthorn."
So we lost our leading lady the week before production. And we made the decision not to stop, not to delay production. We couldn't. Eric Berkovici and I made a decision early on that nothing would stop the production. It's that whole analogy about a shark has to keep moving or he dies. We felt that if Shogun ever stopped, it would never restart. Rejuggle the whole picture, and still we shot a month without a leading lady.
And then we were drying up. We had to have her. We still didn't have her. There was nobody. And I mean, at one point, Paramount said, well, we'll take an American actress and put her in Asian makeup. And we went, oh, we can't do that. Well, it's impossible. The whole picture's over.
Jerry and I were both looking at videos at night of Japanese actresses, and they kept bringing them to the set. Problem was, we were looking for a Japanese actress who could speak English, and we couldn't find any. And there were a number of Japanese actresses we met who were very impressive, and they said, hello, how are you? I'm so glad to be auditioning for this role. And then when we would ask them a question, they would say, hello, how are you? I'm very glad to be auditioning for this role.
So I remember it was like on a Saturday, and there was like three girls in all of Japan left to read. And then all of a sudden we hear a Japanese girl speaking English that we understood. And we didn't really look at the stage because we were so disheartened, we didn't want to look, you know, but we hear this voice, and he looked at me and I looked at him, and it was like two puppets' heads turning and looking over at the stage, and there she was. Yoko Shimada was there.
And we said, well, we've rolled the dice on so many things so far, let's roll the dice again. And we hired her.
If a woman who belonged to a man, as I belong to Lord Buntaro, if she joined with another man, that would be a serious crime.
She worked very, very hard to be able to learn her dialogue in English and learn her dialogue in Japanese as well.
After audition, 3 days after, my agent called me and he said, you're going to do Shogun. I was just surprised. And Jerry Rondon was full of energy and spontaneous. And he was always there for me, supporting my acting.
My son, Luca, who was in Japan at the time, became hired by Frank, I must say, not by me, to be her dialogue coach. And he literally put every line of English in her mouth.
Luca was my coach, and he was very hard teacher. Sometimes he pulled my tongue. Your tongue is here, not there, here.
It was important that she knew what it was that she was saying. Yes, she had the Japanese translation, but that sometimes differed from the English script. So it was important that she understood what it was that she was saying. So we would spend a lot of time going over the meaning of the words. So in the process of doing that, she and I developed a rapport, I mean, for lack of a better word.
And because he was my son, he had an advantage because he would come to me and say, she can't say this word. She can't say earth. I'd say, change it to world. He would go back, he would come back and say, she can't say world either. So her dialogue had to be constantly tailored for her. And what words we never managed to get correctly were done in post-production.
Yoko Shimada, her emotional depth was just staggering. And that seemed odd to me in the sense that the Japanese, in my experience, at least in daily life, seemed not to be very expressive emotionally. They were friendly and wonderful, but emotionally rather hidden. So when she came out with these powerful, powerful scenes of deep, deep feeling, I was really sort of awestruck.
I want to be with thee.
Asleep or awake, thou art with me.
My name is Martin Alvito of the Society of Jesus, Captain Pilot. Lord Toranaga has favored me with his confidence for many years.
Damien Thomas had a big part, and he was a really interesting actor and a very sinewy kind of guy. He was lean and kind of angular and kind of angry looking, and he was perfect for the part.
He was physically beautiful. He had a good voice. He was a real actor, real actor's intelligence.
Damien was sensational, and his command of Japanese, which he didn't speak either, was astounding. He had whole scenes in Japanese. I have no idea how he learned that stuff.
wakarimasu ka? Anjin-san.
Hai, wakarimasu. Domo, Yabu-sama.
Frankie Sakai was a comedian in Japan, actually. He did stand-up comedy. And he had a great look, but I don't think he had done too much dramatic work. Yeah, but he spoke perfect English, understood it, which helped a lot.
He played Yabu, he played this really fierce man, but he was this jolly, funny, always laughing, practical, joking fellow. We had a wonderful time with Frankie Sakai.
We tested him. We just put the stuff on him and did a couple of scenes, and we said, this is him. And luckily, we got him because his look for that part was perfect. And his sense of humor, because Yabu has a sense of humor, really worked.
As God is my judge, if I didn't know better, I believe that the Spaniards or the Benedictine lackeys had deliberately guided him here to plague us.
The two greatest actors I've ever seen on stage are Laurence Olivier and Alan Bedell. Bedell had an incandescent energy.
A classical British actor, done hundreds of roles, hundreds of big movies, very famous in England, had an interesting delivery, an interesting voice.
I talked to John Gielgud about Bedell once. He said, oh yes, he joined me in my company just after the war. He was a very tiresome young actor, I have to tell you. You know, he was a very minor member of the company. He kept sending me notes on my performance. You know, after each production, each performance, he would send me notes. But I do agree with you, very, very gifted. His performance is matchless, and I think in some ways Bedell is the greatest actor I've ever worked with.
I was very lucky that the cast meshed together so well. When I cast them, I tried to get the individual look for all of them, and they worked together as a team. It was just such a pleasure to work with such pros who came from the English theater.